He had built a $52 billion empire from nothing, and not a single person at that reunion knew it, least of all his wife. She stood in the middle of the garden, surrounded by her family's champagne and laughter, and she spat at his feet, called him a burden, a stain on the family name, a man who had never amounted to anything and never would. What she didn't know was that the ground beneath her heels, the estate, the manicured lawn, every blade of grass, legally belonged to him. What would you have done in Daniel Harrow's position? Stay until the very end, because the moment this family realized what they had done, it destroyed everything they had spent 30 years building. If you're enjoying stories like this one, go ahead and hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And before we get into it, where are you watching from today? Are you tuning in from New York, London, Lagos, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where you all are. Now, let's talk about Daniel Harrow. The day of the Whitmore family reunion fell on a Saturday in late August, the kind of day where the heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. The estate in Connecticut had been in Margaret Whitmore's family for 3 generations. Rolling grounds, a fountain at the center of the circular driveway, a house with 14 rooms, and a wine cellar that Margaret's father had started stocking in 1971, it was, by every visible measure, a monument to old money and older pride. Daniel arrived alone. He had driven himself in the same grey sedan he had owned for 11 years, a car with a cracked dashboard and a passenger side window that stuck halfway down. He parked it behind the caterer's van almost instinctively, as if he already knew better than to let it be seen, next to the row of black SUVs and a silver Porsche that belonged to his brother-in-law Carter Whitmore. He was 51 years old, medium height, the kind of build that comes from actual work rather than a gym membership, broad through the shoulders with hands that had calluses on them, though no one at this party would have known what from. His hair had gone mostly grey at the temples. He wore a blue button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled, and dark trousers. Nothing about him announced itself. That was, in fact, the point. That had always been the point. His wife, Serena Whitmore Harrow, was already holding a glass of white wine when he crossed the lawn. She was 47, sharp-featured, with the kind of posture that wealthy families drill into their children from birth. She wore a cream dress and a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked, as she always did at these gatherings, as though she had been born specifically for them, and as though Daniel had wandered in from somewhere else entirely. She saw him approach and did not move toward him. She simply watched with the flat, assessing expression of someone observing an inconvenience arrive. "You're late," she said. "Traffic on the 95, Daniel said. "There's always traffic on the 95. That's why people leave early." She turned back to her conversation without waiting for a response. He got himself a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood at the edge of the gathering. The Whitmore family, in full assembly, was a formidable thing. There were cousins and aunts and second husbands and old family friends, all orbiting around Margaret Whitmore, Serena's mother, who sat at the center of the garden in a high-backed chair like a queen holding court. Margaret was 73. She had never liked Daniel. She had made this clear from the first Thanksgiving he had attended as Serena's husband 22 years ago, and she had never seen any reason to revise her position. Margaret Whitmore came from a family that measured human worth in credentials and zip codes, in the right schools and the right clubs and the right surnames. Daniel had none of these things. He had grown up in rural Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a school librarian. He had put himself through a state university on loans and work study, and a scholarship he had won on the strength of a mathematics exam. He had met Serena at a conference in Boston when they were both 29. She had been different then, or he had believed she was. curious, warm, genuinely interested in ideas rather than appearances. That version of Serena had not survived very long inside the Whitmore gravity. The years of their marriage had been a slow erosion, not loud or violent, nothing so dramatic, just a steady, quiet diminishment, the way water wears stone. Serena had gradually accepted her family's assessment of her husband. Daniel was not ambitious enough, not social enough, not wealthy enough. He worked in... What was it he did exactly? Something with technology? Something with investments? He was so vague about it, so deliberately unimpressive. There had been a period in the early years when she had defended him. When Margaret had made a pointed remark at Christmas dinner, Serena had once said, with quiet conviction, that Daniel was the smartest person she had ever met and that his patience was a form of strength. That was in year 4. By year 9, she had stopped defending him. By year 14, she had stopped noticing that anyone expected her to. The Whitmore family operated on a simple economy of respect. You earned it through display, through titles and addresses, and the right kind of car in the driveway. Daniel participated in none of this. He had no impressive job title he was willing to share. He had no stories of deals and negotiations, no name-dropping, no cultivated air of significant business. He sat at their tables and listened more than he spoke and accepted second helpings of whatever was being served and thanked the host afterward with genuine warmth that somehow read in this company as the gratitude of a lesser person. And so Daniel had learned over 2 decades to be small at these gatherings, to stand at the edges, to absorb the comments and the sighs and the loaded silences without reaction. He had become, within this family, an almost invisible presence, tolerated because Serena kept him, pitied because Serena deserved better, dismissed because he had never once given them any reason to pay serious attention. He had, in fact, worked very hard to give them no such reason. Carter Whitmore found him near the hedge at the east side of the garden, around the time the catering staff began setting out the first plates. Carter was 44, 2 years younger than Serena, and he had all the qualities the Whitmore family admired in a man. He was loud, well-dressed, confident with other people's money, and had an investment firm with a good address and a reputation that was, as would later be established, largely constructed from smoke. "Daniel," Carter said, not warmly, "still driving that old grey thing I saw behind the vans?" "She runs fine," Daniel said. "Runs fine." Carter laughed, glancing at the 2 men standing with him. "That's one way to put it." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a crisp $50 bill, folded once. He held it out toward Daniel with the casual, contemptuous ease of a man dropping a coin into a hat. "Get yourself some new tires at least, for God's sake." The 2 men laughed. Carter was still holding the bill out, waiting. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Carter. His expression did not change. "Keep it," he said quietly. He walked away. He heard Carter say something behind him. Something about pride being a poor man's luxury. And more laughter, but he did not turn back. It was, in the arithmetic of these gatherings, an ordinary moment. It had happened before in different forms. The comment about his car at Christmas, the remark about his suit at Serena's cousin's wedding, the time Margaret had introduced him to a family friend simply as Serena's husband, with a pause before the word husband that somehow managed to contain a lifetime of disappointment. He absorbed all of it. He had always absorbed all of it. What happened next, however, was not ordinary. The gathering had moved to its lunch phase, people spreading across the tables set up on the south terrace, when Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it quietly. It was a message from his attorney, a man named Franklin Osee, with whom he had been working for the better part of 18 months. The message was short: final confirmation. Received. All documents executed. Call when you're ready. Daniel read it twice. He put his phone away. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the salmon that had been placed in front of him, and said nothing. Serena, seated beside him, was in the middle of a story about a renovation project. She was having the kitchen in their house in Greenwich redone, a project that had been consuming her attention and a substantial portion of a joint account. And she did not look at him. What she also did not know was that the house in Greenwich was not technically theirs. It was his. The title had always been in his name, transferred into a trust structure that Franklin had helped him establish years ago in the early days of a business venture that the Whitmore family had known nothing about because Daniel had made absolutely certain they wouldn't. Serena had believed they owned the house jointly. She had believed that for 17 years. It was, Daniel would later reflect, not a lie he had told her. She had simply never asked to see the paperwork because the paperwork was boring and Daniel was the one who handled those things, and why would any of that matter? The lunch stretched into afternoon. The afternoon stretched toward evening. Daniel moved through it quietly, refilling glasses when asked, listening more than speaking, watching. At one point, Margaret called him over to the table where she held court and introduced him to a family acquaintance, a retired judge, with the words, "This is Serena's husband, Daniel. He's been with the family for a long time." 22 years, Daniel thought. A long time. "What is it you do exactly?" the judge asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "Various things," Daniel said, as he always did. Margaret made a small sound, barely audible, the sound a person makes when they are too polite to say the word nothing out loud. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the wine had been freely flowing for several hours, and inhibitions had softened accordingly, that the moment happened. The moment that changed everything. Carter, holding his 4th glass of something amber, had been emboldened enough to deliver what he apparently considered to be a public service. He had gathered a small audience, 3 cousins, an uncle, Serena's friend Patrice, and was retelling with great relish and comic embellishment the story of the $50 bill. His version had grown in the telling. Daniel had supposedly flinched, had supposedly stammered, had supposedly looked close to tears. Daniel was standing close enough to hear all of it. Serena heard it too, and rather than redirect her brother or change the subject, she laughed. She laughed with the specific, brittle quality of someone performing for an audience they cannot afford to disappoint. And then she looked at Daniel across the gathered group, and she said, clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "You know, sometimes I look at him and I genuinely wonder how I ended up here." The group went quiet for a moment. Margaret, nearby, made a sound of agreement. Serena set her wineglass down on a side table. She crossed the 3 feet of distance between them and looked at him with something cold and direct in her expression, the kind of look that had been building for years in the private spaces of their marriage but had never before been deployed in quite this public a fashion. And then she spat. Not metaphorically. She actually tilted her head and spat on the ground, an inch from his shoes, a gesture she had apparently imported from somewhere in her memory of contempt, something she had perhaps seen in a film or a story, and had decided, in this wine-loosened moment, to mean. The gathering went entirely silent. Daniel looked down at the grass. He looked up at his wife. His face was completely still. "Serena?" someone said nervously. It might have been Patrice. Serena did not seem to hear. She held his gaze and said quietly, but with great precision, "You have never, in your entire life, been worthy of this family, and I think we've all known it for a very long time." She picked up her wineglass again and walked away. The group dispersed. Carter cleared his throat and said something about getting a refill. The cousins found somewhere else to be. Margaret, from her chair across the garden, watched Daniel with an expression that was neither apologetic nor uncomfortable, just satisfied, in the way that people are satisfied when reality has finally been stated plainly. Daniel stood where he was for another moment. Then he took his phone out of his pocket and called Franklin Osei. "I'm ready," he said. He had been patient for a very long time. He had been patient through 22 years of small indignities and larger ones, through holidays spent absorbing contempt and weekends spent being introduced as an afterthought, through a marriage that had calcified around him like concrete, while he had quietly, carefully, over the course of many years, built something that no one in the Whitmore family had the imagination to understand was being built. He had been patient because patience in his particular situation was not passivity, it was strategy. The story of how Daniel Harrow came to be worth $52 billion is not a glamorous one. It does not involve a brilliant pitch to a famous investor or a viral product or a famous name. It is, in its essentials, the story of a man who understood things that most people didn't bother to learn, and who worked with an almost inhuman consistency over a very long time. He had begun, in his mid-30s, with a small fund. He had identified, before almost anyone else, the particular intersection of infrastructure technology and data logistics that was about to become indispensable to the global economy. He had invested in companies that were at the time obscure and unglamorous: software firms, data management businesses, a handful of telecommunications infrastructure companies that operated in regions of Southeast Asia and East Africa, where no one from a Connecticut family with old money would have thought to look. He had done all of this through a structure of holding companies and trusts that Franklin Osei, then a young attorney, had helped him design with the specific goal of privacy. Not for any improper reason. Every structure was entirely legal, every tax obligation met with precision, every filing submitted on time and in full. But because Daniel had made a decision very early in his marriage that the Whitmore family's awareness of his finances would do him no good. They would have made claims on it. Serena would have involved her mother. Carter would have had opinions and requests and introductions to offer that Daniel didn't want. Margaret would have revised her estimation of him, which would have been worse in its way than her contempt. He did not want to be valued by people who valued only money. The machinery of that family's greed and condescension would have turned toward him with different energy than contempt, and he had not wanted that energy either. He had wanted, above all else, to be left alone, to work. And the most reliable way to be left alone by ambitious, status-obsessed people is to appear to have nothing they want. He had wanted to be left alone to work, and so he had been. They had dismissed him completely, which was, in its way, the most useful thing they had ever done for him. The holdings had grown. A fund became a portfolio. The portfolio became a constellation of investments, some of which he had taken to majority ownership, some of which he had sold at the right moment and redeployed into the next opportunity. He had, over the course of 15 years, built the skeleton of an empire quietly and without fanfare, the way certain structures are built underground before anyone sees them surface. By the time of the family reunion, the total valuation, that was across all holdings, across all structures, across the entities that traced back through several degrees of separation to the trust that bore his name, was $52.3 billion. Franklin had been his only confidant throughout. Franklin, who had grown from a young attorney into one of the most respected corporate lawyers in the northeastern United States, who had managed the legal architecture of the entire enterprise with the same care and precision that Daniel had managed the financial one. It was Franklin who, 18 months before the reunion, had brought Daniel a piece of information that had set the final events in motion. Serena, it had emerged, had been conducting an affair with a man named Gregory Falk, a developer with whom she had become acquainted through Carter's firm. The affair had been ongoing for 2 years. Gregory was 40, recently divorced, and had the glossy confidence of a man who had always been told he was exceptional and had no particular reason to doubt it. He had, in that period, been lending Serena money, or rather, she had been taking money from him, amounts that were, in the aggregate, substantial, and which she had been using to fund the kitchen renovation and a number of other personal expenditures without Daniel's knowledge. This was discovered by Franklin not through any dramatic surveillance, but through the unglamorous machinery of financial due diligence. Gregory Falk's firm had applied for a significant construction loan, and in the course of that application, certain transaction records had become visible that formed a pattern a careful attorney could read. Franklin had laid it out for Daniel across a conference table in Lower Manhattan on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Serena's transactions, Gregory's transfers, the timeline of their correspondence reconstructed from records legally obtained. The specific clause in their prenuptial agreement, a document Serena had signed, at Margaret's urging ironically, 22 years ago, that made this category of behavior directly relevant to the question of marital assets. Daniel had sat across from Franklin and looked at the documents for a long time. "All right," he had said eventually. "How do you want to proceed?" Franklin had asked. "Not yet," Daniel had said. "I want to wait." He had wanted to wait because he understood timing, because the single most important variable in any complex situation is the moment at which you choose to act. Move too early, and the counterparty still has resources and options. Move at the right moment, and the architecture of the situation simply closes around them. He had waited through the spring and into the summer. He had watched Serena plan her kitchen renovation with Gregory's money. He had watched Carter announce, at a family dinner in June, a new development project, a large commercial real estate development outside Hartford that Carter was funding in partnership with, among others, Gregory Falk's company. He had watched Margaret beam with Whitmore pride at her son's ambitions. And he had known things they did not know. He had known that Carter's firm was under preliminary investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for a pattern of conduct involving misrepresentation to investors, a matter Franklin had become aware of through a contact in the financial regulatory world. He had known that Gregory Falk's development company was carrying debt at a ratio that made the Hartford project a serious financial risk. He had known that the Hartford project's primary lender was a mid-sized regional bank, and that a significant holder of that bank's preferred shares was, through 4 removes of corporate structure, one of Daniel's own holding entities. He had not arranged any of this. He had simply seen it the way a person with very clear vision and very long patience sees things that others miss. The world had arranged itself, and Daniel understood the arrangement. The call to Franklin on the afternoon of the reunion set everything into motion. The following Monday, an attorney representing one of Daniel's holding structures sent a formal request to the Hartford project's lender, triggering a review of the loan covenants. This was a matter of legal right, standard language in the shareholder agreement that had always been there, that no one had paid particular attention to because no one had thought anyone would use it. On the Tuesday, a financial compliance firm, retained by an anonymous party, which was to say Daniel, submitted a formal referral to the SEC office already examining Carter's firm, attaching a carefully organized dossier of documented transactions that the compliance firm had been preparing for several months. On the Wednesday, Franklin O.C. sent a formal notice to Serena's personal attorney. The notice informed her attorney that Daniel Harrow was initiating divorce proceedings, that the prenuptial agreement was being invoked in its entirety, and that a full accounting of all assets, including the house in Greenwich, whose title documents were attached, was required within 30 days. The notice also informed her attorney that Daniel Harrow's total net worth, for the purposes of the prenuptial agreement's provisions regarding financial disclosure, was $52.3 billion. The prenuptial agreement, which Margaret had insisted upon to protect Serena from Daniel's presumably negligible assets, contained a provision that had been standard language at the time of drafting. In the event that either party was found to have engaged in financial misconduct during the marriage, including accepting undisclosed third-party financial transfers, the offending party's rights to any marital assets were void. Margaret had had the agreement drafted to protect her daughter from a man she considered to have nothing. She had inadvertently drafted a document that now protected his $52 billion from her daughter entirely. The first call Serena received was from her personal attorney, and she did not understand it. She called back 3 times, asking him to repeat himself. The attorney, to his credit, was very patient. He went through the numbers again. He explained the trust structure. He explained the holding companies. He explained the prenuptial provision. Serena's response was a silence so long and so complete that her attorney eventually asked if she was still on the line. She drove to the Greenwich house. She had no other instinct, nowhere else to go, and she sat in the kitchen that was being renovated with Gregory Falk's money, surrounded by unfinished tile work and exposed wall panels, and she made calls. She called Carter. She called her mother. She called Gregory. Carter did not have the attention to spare for her crisis. He had just received, that same day, notification from his firm's compliance officer that SEC investigators were formally requesting documents. His assistant had forwarded him 2 emails before he had even arrived at his office. He had been on the phone with his own attorneys since 8 in the morning and was in no position to manage his sister's disaster. Gregory Falk had received, on the same day, notification from the Hartford Project's lender that a covenant review had been triggered and that disbursement of the next tranche of construction financing was suspended pending the review's completion. The project's construction schedule depended on that tranche. The contractors would need to be notified, the subcontractors, the architects. Gregory's partner in the deal, Carter's firm, was simultaneously dealing with an SEC inquiry. The financial architecture of the Hartford project, which had been leveraged with great confidence and very thin margins, began to come apart with a speed that surprised everyone except the person who had understood the margins to begin with. Margaret received Serena's call that evening. She listened to her daughter's account of the documents, the trust structure, the $52 billion, and the prenuptial provision, and she went completely quiet. She asked Serena to repeat the number, $52.3 billion. Margaret sat in the high-backed chair in the sitting room of the Connecticut estate and thought about 22 years of dismissal, 22 years of introductions as Serena's husband, 22 years of $50 bills and comments about grey sedans and expressions of satisfaction when the truth was finally stated plainly. She thought about the ground beneath her heels. And then she thought about something else, the estate, the Connecticut property. She had assumed, as she had always assumed, that it was hers. It had been in her family for 3 generations. It was, in her mind, as permanent and inviolable as a mountain. But Margaret's late husband, Robert Whitmore, had taken a loan against the estate in 2009 during a difficult period in the family's finances that the family had never discussed publicly. He had restructured the loan several times. After his death in 2016, the estate's financial situation had been managed by Carter, who had handled it the way Carter handled most things, with great confidence and insufficient attention to detail. In 2019, Carter had needed to restructure the debt again. He had worked with a private lender, a quiet and unremarkable financial entity that had agreed to carry the debt at favorable terms in exchange for a right of first refusal on any future sale and a seat in the lending structure that gave it review rights over major financial decisions relating to the property. That private lender was, through 3 removes of corporate structure, one of Daniel Harrow's holding entities. Carter had not known this. It had not been disclosed because it was not required to be disclosed, because the holding structure was designed precisely to permit this kind of invisible positioning. It was legal, it was meticulous, and it meant that the Connecticut estate, the monument to Whitmore pride and 3 generations of old money, had, for the past 5 years, been financially entangled with the man they had all agreed was not worthy of the family. Franklin sent the relevant documentation to the estate's title company on a Thursday morning. He also sent a formal notice informing the estate's current managers, Carter and Margaret, that the lending entity was exercising its review rights in response to the SEC inquiry into Carter's firm, which constituted a material event under the lending agreement's covenants. The review would take time. During the review, no refinancing, no transfer of assets, and no major decisions regarding the estate could proceed without the lender's approval. The Whitmore estate was, in effect, frozen. The confrontation happened on a Friday, 9 days after the reunion. It was not a courtroom, and it was not a boardroom. It was, appropriately, the Connecticut estate. The same garden where the reunion had been held, though the catering tables were gone now and the fountain was off for maintenance, and the whole grounds had the slightly deflated quality of a stage after the performance is over. Serena had called Daniel and demanded he come. Margaret had apparently been present for that call. Carter had driven up from the city that morning, pale and quieter than Daniel had ever seen him. Gregory Falk was notably absent. His involvement with Serena had become, in the compressed and devastating weeks since the documents had arrived, not a romantic secret, but a financial liability, and he had chosen, with the instincts of a man who had always prioritized his own position, to become unavailable. Daniel drove the grey sedan up the circular driveway and parked it directly in front of the fountain. He got out and walked across the lawn toward the terrace. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore. A blue shirt, dark trousers, unremarkable shoes. Nothing about him announced itself. Serena was waiting on the terrace. Margaret was beside her in the high-backed chair, which had been carried outside apparently for this purpose. Carter stood behind them, his arms crossed, though he had the slightly unfocused look of a man who has not slept adequately in several days. "You need to explain what you've done," Serena said, as he crossed the terrace. Her voice was controlled, but the control was effortful. "You need to explain all of this." Daniel stopped a few feet away and looked at the 3 of them. "What would you like explained?" he said. "The money," Serena said. "The trust, the holding companies, the $52 billion. Where did it come from? When did it... How long have you..." She stopped, restarted. "You hid this from me for our entire marriage." "I built it during our marriage," Daniel said. "I didn't hide it." "You never asked." "I never asked because you led me to believe." "I never told you anything," Daniel said. His voice was even and quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there at previous gatherings. A solidity, a weight, the sound of a person who has nothing left to perform. "I was vague when you asked what I did. I drove an old car, I wore ordinary clothes, I said nothing, and did nothing to suggest I was anything other than what you all decided I was." He paused. "You filled in the rest yourselves. You decided what I was worth, and I let you decide." "That's manipulation," Carter said from behind the two women. His voice was thin. "Is it?" Daniel said. He looked at Carter. "You handed me a $50 bill in front of your friends 9 days ago. You told me to get new tires. For God's sake." He let those last 3 words sit in the air a moment, the way Carter had said them, with the same intonation. "Did I manipulate you into that?" Carter said nothing. "Or did you do that because you had already decided who I was, and no information I could have provided would have changed it? Because this family had a story about me, and you were all very comfortable inside that story, and you never had any interest in the actual facts." Margaret spoke then. Her voice had lost some of its usual iron certainty, but it was still commanding. "You built this fortune on the back of my family's connections, on Serena's network, on introductions made at this estate." "Name one," Daniel said. Margaret paused. "Name one person I met through this family who was relevant to any business I built. Name one introduction, one dinner, one connection that contributed anything." He was still calm. "You will find, if you look carefully, that I did not use your network. Your network had no interest in me. I built what I built precisely in the places and in the ways that had nothing to do with old money Connecticut. I worked in markets and regions that this family had never considered and would never have understood." He paused again. "Your family's connections were not a resource to me. They were a reminder every year to keep working." Serena had been watching him throughout this with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before, a kind of fracturing, as if the story she had maintained for so long was losing structural integrity in real time. "You should have told me," she said, and her voice now had a different quality in it, something cracked beneath the surface. "Whatever else, you should have told me." "Why?" he said. It was a genuine question, not a hostile one. "So that this family could have treated me well because of what I had, rather than who I was. Would that have been better?" He looked at her steadily. "You know the answer to that. We both know the answer to that." The silence that followed was long. Serena looked away first. "The prenuptial agreement," Daniel said, "will be honored in full. Franklin's office will be in contact with your attorney regarding the process. The Greenwich House title will transfer formally within 30 days. I will ask for nothing from this marriage except the right to leave it." He turned then to Margaret. "The estate's lending review will proceed as documented. Carter's firm's situation with the Securities and Exchange Commission is a separate matter, and I have no part in where that lands. The compliance referral was submitted by an independent party." He held Margaret's gaze a moment longer. "I have at no point in 22 years done anything to harm this family. I absorbed what this family gave me, and I kept working. Whatever comes next for you comes from what you built yourselves." He paused. "Then, I think we're done here." He turned around and walked back across the lawn. He did not look back. The grey sedan pulled out of the circular driveway and turned onto the road, and the Whitmore estate, with its fountain off for maintenance and its slightly deflated terrace, receded in the rearview mirror. The months that followed moved with the implacable pace of legal and financial processes, which is to say, slowly, methodically, and without mercy. Carter's firm was the first to fall. The SEC investigation, expanded by the dossier submitted in that Tuesday compliance referral, uncovered a pattern of misrepresentation across multiple investment vehicles over a 6-year period. Carter's firm was fined a sum that erased the better part of his personal wealth. He avoided criminal charges, but only just, and only because several of his former colleagues did not share his fortune in that respect. The firm was dissolved. Carter's name, which had been his primary asset, became, in the world of Connecticut finance, a liability. The Hartford project collapsed. Gregory Falk's company, unable to sustain the cost overruns that followed the suspended tranche and unwilling to recapitalize at the terms available to a firm now associated with a dissolved and disgraced investment house, filed for restructuring. The project would eventually be completed by a different developer years later, and Gregory would go on to diminished circumstances that he bore with considerably less grace than Daniel had borne his performed ones. The estate's lending review produced findings that, combined with the removal of Carter's firm as a source of financial management, required Margaret to engage new advisors. Those advisors, looking at the full picture of the estate's financial entanglement, presented her with options that were all variations on the same basic reality. The property required significant refinancing, the terms available were not what they had been, and the most favorable terms on the table came from the entity that was already in the lending structure. Margaret did not refinance with that entity. She sold. The estate, the 14 rooms and the wine cellar, started in 1971, and the fountain in the circular driveway, it was listed and sold within the year. She moved to a smaller property in the same town. It was comfortable. It was not a monument. Serena's divorce was completed in 11 months. The prenuptial agreement was honored exactly as written. She received what she had brought into the marriage, and nothing of what he had built within it, which was, in the cold arithmetic of the agreement's language, nothing. She kept personal property, a car, and a modest account. She and Gregory Falk were not in contact, which was, by all subsequent accounts, a relief to both parties. She took a position, eventually, at a non-profit in Boston. She was, by those who encountered her in that period, described as quieter than she had once been. It was the kind of quietness that comes not from peace but from recalibration, a person learning, late, to measure themselves by different instruments. Daniel did not remark on any of this publicly. He had no interest in the public dimension of what had happened. He settled, in the year following the divorce, into what his life actually looked like when it was no longer arranged around concealment. He moved to a house on the coast of Maine, not large, but with a direct view of the water and a workshop where he could use his hands in the evenings. He ran the workshop the way he had always run his life, without advertisement, without an audience, building things that were useful and solid and did not need to announce themselves. He made furniture mostly, a long oak table, a set of bookshelves for a local school, a rocking chair for his mother, which he drove down to Ohio himself and assembled in her living room on a Sunday afternoon in October, and which she declared the finest thing she had ever sat in, and which made him, for the first time in a very long time, simply and uncomplicated happy. He continued to oversee the portfolio, though he had, over the years, assembled a team of exceptional people for the operational work, and his days had a spaciousness they had never had before. He established, in the second year, a foundation. Its primary focus was educational opportunity in rural communities, scholarships for students at state universities, grants for rural public libraries, fellowships in mathematics and the sciences for students who could not otherwise access them. He named it the Harrow Foundation, after his parents. His father, the mechanic from Ohio, had died a decade before and would not see it. His mother was still alive, sharp and pleased in the way that mothers are pleased when the long arc of a child's difficulty resolves itself. He met a woman named Clara at a foundation board meeting in the second year. She was a marine biologist by training and a foundation director by evolution, with a directness and an ease in her own presence that he found, after so many years of performed smallness, profoundly restful. They moved slowly. There was no drama in it, no theatrical reversal, just two people who had each lived enough life to know what they actually wanted and to choose it without complication. He drove the grey sedan for one more year after the divorce. It was not a gesture. It simply still ran fine, and he had never been interested in cars as symbols. He replaced it eventually with a vehicle that was equally unremarkable, though it had a passenger window that opened all the way. At no point did he speak publicly about the Whitmore family or the reunion, or any of it. There was nothing to say. The events had spoken with more precision than any statement he could have issued. There is a particular cruelty in dismissing someone completely. In looking at another person and deciding with great confidence and no real information that they are worth nothing and will always be worth nothing. It is a cruelty that its practitioners rarely recognize as cruelty because it is wrapped in the language of honesty. We are simply stating the truth, they say. We are just being realistic. But the people who were realistic about Daniel Harrow, the people who were simply stating the truth, were not, it turned out, seeing reality. They were seeing a reflection of their own assumptions in a mirror they had never thought to question. They had looked at a man and seen nothing of consequence because they had already decided what consequence looked like, and it looked nothing like him. He had let them see what they expected. He had been patient. He had built, in the space their indifference created, something $52 billion large. And then, on an August afternoon, a woman who had spent 22 years tolerating him spat at his feet in front of her family. And he made a phone call. True power, Daniel had learned, does not require display. It does not drive the newest car or say the sharpest thing at dinner. It does not announce itself or seek the approval of people who have already made up their minds. It simply is what it is underneath whatever surface the world is comfortable with, waiting, with infinite patience, for the moment when it needs to be used. The Whitmore family had given him many things over 22 years. Most of them were small and cruel and intended to diminish. But the most valuable thing they had given him was their absolute, unwavering certainty that he was nothing. It was the only environment in which something like his life's work could have been built without interference. And for that, in a cold and private way, he was almost grateful. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people find this channel and hear stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.